Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you for being here for another week. This is our May edition of the Policy Pulse segment that Bryan, Driscoll, and I do. Bryan is obviously my esteemed co-host on this segment every month, and we have some really interesting new policies that we're going to walk through, talk through, and hopefully get some additional insight into in an effort to not only educate all of us, myself included, but also kind of be prepared for what we might need to keep in mind down the line. So without further ado, let's jump into this first policy kind of update or, FYI, which is that the Department of Labor pulled back on independent contractor enforcement, which is very interesting because I did an episode, maybe it was earlier this year, maybe it might have been last year when I was on maternity leave, where I talked about the importance of classification when it comes to independent contractors and just contractors in general versus, employees. So can you walk us through this, Bryan? What is this all hinging on?
The classification is a huge issue. A lot of times employers really just want to skirt taxes and overhead, so they hire people, they partner with people as independent contractors instead of employees when they actually are employees. So the Department of Labor enforces employee classification at the federal level. Some states, which we'll talk about, have stricter laws. The Department of Labor in 2024, there was the Biden administration started enforcing a new rule that made it harder for employers to classify workers as independent contractors. There was essentially a presumption that workers are employees unless the business can prove that they're independent contractors. Mm-hmm. The Trump administration has reversed that in sort of a weird way. They haven't actually reversed the rule. They've stopped enforcing that rule and will instead enforce pre-2024 standards of the totality of circumstances test, which basically just looks at several key factors to determine whether a worker is an employee or an independent contractor. And there's no presumption. They're not starting with any presumption of this person is an employee or an independent contractor. They're starting neutral, essentially. And so that's the distinction right now. So a lot of people, over the last few months have been sort of auditing their classification, making sure that their workers are classified correctly under this new standard. Now the rug has been pulled out and we're going back to the old standard, which is more business friendly.
And they used to have to take maybe not used to, but up until recently, there was a kind of like a test that basically determined whether someone fit the criteria or not, right? Or what determined whether someone was an employee versus a contractor.
Yeah. So essentially the old and now current enforcement standard is essentially totality of circumstances. You look at the worker and the employer relationship, and you look at different factors of like control and independence. What control does the employer have over the worker? How much independence does the worker have? How much of the worker's monetary income comes from this particular employer? Skills, the permanency of the position, and whether it's an integral part of the business. The Biden administration had sort of reduced that standard, like we talked about, to make it a presumption that everybody was an employee. Mm-hmm. And that kind of mirrored what California currently has. There's a few other states too, like New Jersey, Illinois, Washington. They have some stronger tests. California is probably the strongest of them. California's is the ABC test. And so the ABC test it doesn't actually necessarily align with ABC. It's not a great acronym, but it's autonomy, outside business, and independent trade. So is the worker free from control and direction from the employer? Can the worker perform work does the worker perform work outside the scope of that business's core duties, core business? And is the worker engaged in an independent trade, an independent business, that this is how the work is usually performed? So in that instance, failure to satisfy any one of those criteria means the worker is an employee. Whereas under the old and now current federal standard, no single factor is determinative. And that's why we look at it as the totality of circumstances.
Understood. And something that, of course, for all the listeners, we do prepare for these episodes, and something that Bryan wrote in our agenda is that this is really a highlight of how there's so much political whiplash for HR every time the party changes, every time the president changes. And it's really true. And I've never really thought of it that way, but it's like, of course, this is at the federal level, and there are states that have stricter rules or are more conservative with certain things that are, especially states that are more employee friendly, like California, New York, New Jersey, and a couple other states. But it's just not something that I really realized that, like, oh yeah, every time there's a change in the White House, we have to prepare for what that means for our jobs. I mean, everything from like I-9s to what makes for a, reasonable termination or even in a reasonable accommodation. It's interesting. I'm curious, you talk about in our agenda, I realize that the listeners are not reading this, but in our agenda, you talk about private lawsuits, and how they, private lawsuits can still abide by or use this stricter pre-2025 rule, let's say the Biden era rule. So how does that work?
So yeah, this doesn't mean that anybody is barred from bringing a lawsuit. Employees are still, independent contractors are still welcome to bring private lawsuits. And depending on where they're located, they may actually fall under the stricter ABC type tests. And so they can use that to their advantage based on their location to say, no, I am actually entitled to unemployment benefits because I was misclassified. I should have been an employee.
I see.
So the state laws still apply. The federal is sort of the umbrella right now, and
Right.
The state laws are applicable in certain circumstances.
Got it. So basically, if an employee, or let's say a contractor who feels as though they should have been classified as an employee, wants to sue the company, they can do so in a private lawsuit against that organization. It's the Department of Labor that's not going to engage in a public lawsuit against a company for misclassification because of these new rules.
Correct.
At least at the federal level.
Right. So there's an example of, I think it was 2016, where there was a FedEx warehouse, I think in Tampa, that had a few hundred warehouse workers, and they were all classified as contractors. But they were all told what hours to work, what work to do, how to do it. Like, they were clearly employees. And the Department of Labor received a complaint from several employees, and I think from the union as well. But the Department of Labor took action against the employer for those for that misclassification. So that's something that we probably will see less of today, because of, like we talked about, because of the enforcement shift that is happening.
Got it. So I think first of all, that's like wild and crazy that every single person in a warehouse could be a contractor. It's just physically not possible. But that's the way some of these things go. I think sometimes companies think that no one will complain and they won't get caught, and that's that. Regardless, I think for listeners who are in HR, or who, maybe are thinking about their own classifications, their own independent contractors and employees, there are some things I think that we can probably impart on them, which is, of course, to really think about and understand the rules of each state in which they operate. That's always going to, we know that there are states that are more litigious or more conservative or more strict than the federal government. And that will probably always be the case, that there will be states that have stricter rules. It's the same thing with like minimum wages. Like the federal minimum wage is 7 something, but in New York it's 15, or in New Jersey it's 15. So everyone needs to really be clear on what those state by state laws are. But what other recommendations do you have for the listeners who are in HR and are really starting to think about this and what it means for them?
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, Traci, because also we need to remember that the laws that apply to your employees are the laws in the state in which they live and work. And in, today with so many more remote workers, that's something that HR needs to be acutely aware of,
Right.
the laws in the state of their employee. So, I mean, besides what you said, which is a key component of this, it's also important that companies and HR teams understand what's happening and audit their independent contractors now, because that can actually be a defense for companies. If you end up getting sued, you can say, well, we've actually initiated the process. We know you're not going to get off scot-free, but this can be a defense for you to show that like we are being proactive about this. We understand there might be an issue. We are working to rectify the problems that we currently have. And like you talked about with politics, plan for possible changes. Like this could
don't get too comfortable.
Right, exactly. In 2026, with a change, if a change happens in Congress, like that could slow things down. In enforcement from the executive branch, they may be less willing to push hard on more business friendly things. So, and then again in 28, like things can change rapidly. This didn't used to be a space where things changed so frequently, but it seems like over the last few years, it has been much more challenging to stay static in the HR field. So I think those are a couple key things that employers need to know about, HR teams need to know about. Essentially, misclassification has not gone away. It's still a very important point of employing employees and independent contractors, and understanding the differences and how to set up your business correctly to handle both.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. That's fair. It's, I was thinking of something snarky to say about our next topic as a segue, and maybe I should just lead into it, but you were talking about how this is not usually something that changed so much. And, we had a little bit more, of a static approach to these things. And that's what leads us to SHRM. And so that was what part of my snarky statement, because of course these listeners who have been here a while, they know my stance on some of SHRM's recent decisions. We're not going to be talking about some of the recent decisions in this next topic, but we are going to be talking about SHRM because they published a data brief on 2025 automation displacement. And this data brief estimated the near-term risk of automation-related job displacement using public data. And of course, a big topic, we've talked about it, you and I, even on a separate non-policy pulse segment on an episode, the way that AI and automation may or may not impact people in their personal lives and their professional lives, how it may or may not impact their jobs. And so this data brief really is very on the nose with that type of subject. So can you walk us through what the data brief kind of shared and what some of the takeaways were?
Sure. So SHRM didn't conduct any survey or anything like that. They took publicly available data and basically distilled it down. So essentially, for me anyway, the key takeaways from this are that about 20 million workers, according to this data, are at high or very high risk of job displacement from automation or AI. That boils down to about 20% in blue collar, 15% in admin support roles, and 17% in finance and insurance. So what this looks at is it's looking at, obviously, at AI. That's, a hot thing for the last couple of years. So like it's obviously looking at that, but it's also looking at automation more generally. So some of these, like the blue collar work, that's not necessarily AI. That's more automation focused, right, machine automation. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So the the thing about this report from SHRM, this data from SHRM, is that it's focused on near term, not necessarily long term. They're focused on how many current roles are being automated, whether again through machine automation or AI, and it's looking at the amount of people who are currently working. To go back to the previous topic, independent classification, independent contractors who are working side gigs, who are working in the gig economy. And that's roughly 40% of the American workforce now is either full-time gig work or has a side hustle of some kind. So this is, it's important information to know about, especially for HR teams, understanding where the automation may be occurring within their business, within their industry, and what they need to look out for.
Interesting. This is going to sound insane. My first thought around this, because I always try, whenever there's like a data point or something, I realized they didn't run the study and they just used whatever was available. Classic. I'm just kidding. I warned everyone, I'm a little snarky today. They use what was available. They're distilling this down. They say, okay, these are people who are at the highest risk, which is fine. However, my first thought was like, how do I take this data and actually translate it into what that looks like? Because it's just the way that I like process data and information. I like to try and visualize it. So it made me think about when I recently got my blood drawn for a regular routine like lab work. And I went into the Quest Diagnostic Center and I checked in on a tablet. There was no one there. No human in sight other than the phlebotomists and those of us waiting to be stuck from our arms. And it was really interesting because that to me is an example of how automation replaced someone who was maybe making $50,000 a year. And it's a tablet. It's literally a standing tablet. And then it asks you, how did we do at the end? You know, like, how was the check-in experience? Like, you scan your ID, you do everything. You scan your insurance card. It was fascinating. And it's not to say that I didn't expect that or see it coming, of course. And I've been in doctors' offices where there's one of those and then two folks at the front desk. And maybe that replaced one person. But it's interesting because all of what you shared and all of those real life scenarios that I am thinking of, especially when we think about these blue collar jobs, admin roles that could be affected, and finance and insurance, as you mentioned, it might not be every job, but it could be 1/3. It could be 50%. It could be less than that. And my next thought on that is like how important it is to upskill, not only as an individual, but also for people in our organizations to help them be as educated on these new advances in technology as possible. And I know that's something that you kind of prepared to talk about also, that there's this, almost this integration of literacy into learning and development channels and opportunities in organizations. And there are a whole other host of insights there. But one of the questions that I asked you before we started recording was if SHRM shared any recommendations, because they did all of this work. They spent hours and hours and hours and hours analyzing God knows how many data points. And you shared that there was not a recommendation made by SHRM, which I think is like a totally missed opportunity because they are the Society for Human Resources Management. And to me, there would be a relevant article linked there that would say, okay, hey, HR leaders who are paying hundreds of dollars a year or more to subscribe to our material, here's what you can do about this. Or here's what you need to think about if you manage people in these roles, because it's not necessarily just the people who are these machine operators or admin or finance people. It's also the people who manage them, because if you don't have anyone to manage, you have to also be literate in managing these automation tools or, new advances. So missed opportunity there, SHRM. I'll take any chance I can get to let you know that. But I'm curious, Bryan, I'm going to step off my soapbox for a moment and stop poking at SHRM. But what if you were the person writing this brief and you concluded with what you can do to upskill or, anticipate this and be prepared for this if you're, in a higher risk category, what would you say? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, first I'll start by seconding your
Yes,
chastising of SHRM, because the whole point of pulling this data together is to say, here's what you can do. Here are some
Right.
ideas. It doesn't have to be everything. Doesn't all have to be great, but like at least take that next step and say, here are some ideas.
Yeah, like close the loop, SHRM. Close the loop.
Absolutely. Missed opportunity for sure. I think that if there's one big takeaway for me, it's one thing that I've been telling clients for years when they come with different concerns, different questions. It's that you can't eliminate risk. You cannot eliminate it, but you can know about the risk and calculate the risk. And that's kind of what we're in right now, as we've seen with the last couple of years. That's where HR teams need to go in and conduct a role by role risk analysis of each position. What is potential? Where is potential loss for to automation or to AI? Is it necessary to make that shift? Because as you and I have talked about multiple times on your show, AI is not perfect. And coming from the lawyer lens, AI is biased and discriminatory. And without a human looking over it, it will continue to be biased and discriminatory. So that is incredibly important thing for HR to keep in mind when they're doing this risk analysis. But to your point also about upskilling, like that needs to be part of the L&D. That needs to be part of even before AI, like a decade, 2 decades ago, that still should have been part of an HR's duty, HR department's duties, is to ensure that employees are not only staying up to date on current trends, whatever it is in your industry, but also on skilling, on what is it that they want to do. Maybe there's a position that they'd be better at within your organization, and all you have to do is give them a little training on it, help them make that jump. And that's where upskilling is important. Again, to your point about managers possibly not having anybody left to manage. What do they do now? And there's I think there's so much uncertainty, not only from a regulatory perspective, but also from a what can AI do today and what in the world is it going to be able to do tomorrow. It also is on the human level, like, what are these people going to do? If your risk analysis shows this person, this person, this person, we can automate it for $20,000 a year total. What do those people do? And that I think is one of the more moral questions, the deeper questions in this whole AI and automation discussion.
Yeah, you're so right. And it did make me think that we should definitely talk about the hiring bias charges in AI more recently, because to your point, there are imperfections in AI. Every tool, every human, everything has an imperfection, and there needs to be monitoring of tools that we kind of relinquish our control to. And so I think this was already probably over a month ago, but the ACLU filed EEOC and state charges alleging that Intuit, an employer, and HireVue, which was the vendor, used an AI video screening tool that discriminated against a deaf and indigenous applicant based on disability and race, and that Intuit failed to provide a reasonable accommodation. Which, these are stories that you hear about, and they're stories that you hear about companies wanting to prevent too. Like we know that these things happen. You've just shared that, we know that AI can be discriminatory and there needs to be someone monitoring it. So do you want to, I guess, segue into this for us and walk us through what happened there? I think it is a good segue, because as we think about this automation displacement and the risk of that, these are some of the arguments that you can't just fully displace all of these human workers with tools, especially if they're generative AI tools or generative automation, because those are things that ultimately might be making decisions.
Exactly. And because all of the AI systems that we have been trained on biased data, the outputs are biased.
Right.
The outputs favor people who go to certain schools. They favor people who have certain longevity or certain positions. And historically, those people, frankly, tend to look like me. And that perpetuates the bias and discrimination. The ACLU case, they've filed against, I think it was HireView. It was an AI onboarding hiring software that did video screening, and people had to basically talk to an AI questioner, and that was the initial screen. But there was no, or there were limited accommodations for people who were deaf, or people of marginalized backgrounds, and because of that, people were discriminated against during the screening process. They were otherwise qualified, but were either unable to complete the screening process because of the way the software worked, or they were discriminated against and sent to the recycle bin instead of passed through to the hiring manager. And that is the point that the EEOC made a couple of years ago now, and has restated several times, that if you use AI screening software, if you use AI software in your hiring process, in your promotion process at all, you need a human to ensure that it is being used in a non-discriminatory manner. And that requires audits, that requires having someone look through things manually. And the reason the EEOC has said that is, and the reason it's important here, is because they have said the vendor, the software maker, is not the one who will be held liable. It will be the employer.
Of course.
It will be the one using the software, the company using the software. So that's why HR needs to be aware of this, that they could be putting their company in legal jeopardy if they're trying to fast track some parts of the hiring process.
That makes total sense to me. I think, sure, maybe Intuit will then sue the vendor that they signed on with. Maybe. But I do think that the employer is the one responsible, because at the end of the day, the candidate is applying to that company, and they're expecting there is an expectation that candidates are accommodated if they need accommodation. That is literally in most job postings, you see that. I know we have it where it's like, hey, if you need an accommodation for any type of disability or otherwise, like reach out to this email. And the reality is like, as candidates, it's a very vulnerable experience. They're putting all of their information into this company's hands. They have no idea where it's going. They have no idea who's looking at it. And then you have a vendor who arguably does not have a very well vetted product based on what we know. I mean, I've never used it, so I don't know exactly. But then, you have the employer kind of just trusting it. That's what it seems like. This is, allegedly. But there are a lot of warnings here to heed, that for all of us, when we think about automation and we think about AI and fast tracking and streamlining and optimizing, whatever other buzzwords we want to use, that there has to be not only a process, but also guardrails to ensure that things are done fairly and accurately and without any type of bias or discrimination. I mean, that's like the whole point of these things too.
Exactly. And that goes back to the point of risk elimination, that it's just not possible. But you have to know what the risks are. You have to know what the compliance and regulation concerns could be in order to be able to take action to protect the company against them, and to ensure that there's a fair and equitable hiring process for everyone. And it's a key point too that you made about accommodations during the hiring process. A lot of employers are just unaware that accommodation starts when someone is a candidate, not when they've been hired, but when they're a candidate. When they make contact with your company, you have to accommodate any reasonable needs they may have.
Right. And you know what? I'm sure that there are, employers out there who are like, oh, I don't want to bother. If they need an accommodation while they're a candidate, then, let's just not go through with it, which is, by the way, discriminatory. Just in case anyone thinks that's a reasonable thing to say, it's not. And, look, we know that there are employers and there are managers out there who are quote unquote old school in their approach, and they don't want to, they think it's an inconvenience to go through an accommodation process. But like, get over yourself. That's just not how the world works. Certainly not in the United States, when there are these guardrails to ensure that people who are qualified candidates who also may need accommodation, that they get what they need. So I think your advice on really scrutinizing the vendors that companies use and auditing those tools regularly, and auditing all of the data and all of the tools, auditing everything regularly, is a really good best practice to have. So Bryan, thank you for this extremely insightful Policy Pulse monthly update. I'm really interested to see what we get in June. I feel like every month we're getting like some even more and more interesting stuff to talk about. And it's great to have, an expert in employment law and just law in general who can walk us through all of this. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And I'm hopeful that we will start to see some Supreme Court cases fall in the next couple of months. So we will have definitely more things to talk about and more analysis to discuss, to make sure that we're understanding what the Supreme Court is saying and the impact that has for employers.
Yes, amazing. And for all the listeners who want to connect with Bryan or learn more about our Policy Pulse segments, you can look in the show notes. You can reach out to Bryan, connect with him on LinkedIn, and everything, again, will be linked in the show notes. And if you've missed any of our Policy Pulse updates or segments, they come out once a month, pretty regularly, every 4 weeks roughly. So we'll see you in another 4. Bryan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.